Howdy, y'all. Oh, wait a minute, wrong outfit. That was for you, Elizabeth. I wanted you to feel at home. A short history of Santa Claus for adults. In the 1660s, the Dutch came with their patron saint, St. Nicholas. He was the saint of children, sailors, and unwed mothers. They had a nickname for him. They called him Sinterklaas. The English were already here in America with Father Christmas, who wore a long red robe, trimmed in white fur, rode a white horse, and left presents for the children in their shoes. The French were already here in America with Père Noël, the Spanish with Papa Noel. Somehow, around the time of the end of the Revolutionary War, the English and Dutch had intermarried, and Sinterklaas became Santa Claus. And he was born right here in America and very quickly moved to the North Pole, where he lives to this day. In 1808, Washington Irving wrote a history of New York, and in it he described Santa Claus as a right small elf. He rode in a wooden wagon pulled by horses, and he distributed gifts to the children through their stockings hung by the chimneys. In 1822, Dr. Clement Moore, a theologian who had 100 acres where Wall Street is today, was riding home in the back of his sleigh, listening to the cadence of the harness bells of the horses, when he penned a poem called "'Twas a Night Before Christmas." He called it a visit from St. Nicholas. It was never meant to be published. He had wrote it for his 3 girls at home. And that year, his wife, that night, she read that poem to the girls. The next year, it became a tradition. And the next year, they were visited by a niece. And when the niece heard the poem, she asked for a copy of it. And Dr. Clement Moore's wife gave her a copy. And she took it back to her local newspaper, and the next year it was published in the paper. It wasn't until 1838 that Dr. Clement Moore admitted he had been the one who had penned the poem. He was afraid he wouldn't be respected as a scholar if it was found out that he had penned the poem. In 1839, Santa was started showing up in some of the early department stores. By the early 1900s, Santa was being put alongside another character that had this red nose. In 1938, Montgomery Wards passed out a pamphlet of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. They gave out 2.5 million copies that year. A man by the name of Robert May saw that, and he put that poem to music. And in 1948, he took it to Bing Crosby, and he said, "Would you sing this song?" Bing Crosby looked at it and said, "No, I don't do children's songs." So he next took it to Gene Autry. And Gene Autry said, "No, I don't think I'll do it." And his wife said, "You better reconsider that." Thank God for wives. And the rest is history. The song became the second most selling Christmas record ever, only behind Bing Crosby's White Christmas. Today, you'll see Santa Claus in over 45,000 malls across the United States. So the next time you're walking through the mall and you see Santa, and he looks like he's a little harried, it's been the day when has both of his legs are now soaking wet. He's been spit upon numerous times. Untold children have coughed in his face. Just wave at him and say, "Ho, ho, ho, Merry Christmas." A short history of Santa Claus. This was an especially happy Christmas for John and Jessie. They had been married for a number of years, and they lived out on the plains of Kansas. But the reason this Christmas was special is Jessie was with child, their first child. And John was so happy. Jessie's mother had came because it was right at Christmas time when the child was to be born. And Jessie's mom had spent the week, and they had been preparing for the Christmas dinner, and they had made all kinds of wonderful things to eat. It was Christmas Eve morning when Jessie began having those first pains of childbirth. And John had stood at the window and watched the snows as they were falling that day, and they fell wet and heavy all day long. Jessie had been upstairs with her mother for several hours now. He had tried to get to the doctor, but the snows were too deep, and the doctor had sent a message that he could not come. And John was getting worried. As he was looking out the window, he went over to the door, and as he walked towards the door, there was a knock at the door, and he thought, perhaps the doctor has came. And he rushed to open the door, and when he opened the door, there was a stranger standing there. And the stranger said, "May I come in? May I warm myself by your fire?" And John said, "Sure, come in. What are you doing out on a night like this anyway?" And the stranger just said, "I come where I'm called." Well, that didn't make a lot of sense to John, but he invited him in and took off his coat and hat and hung it up. And the stranger began to warm himself by the fireplace. And John began to talk to him again. And it was about that time that Jessie's mother came down the stairs and said, "John, your wife had the baby, but it was stillborn." And John couldn't believe it. Here, they'd been so excited right here at Christmas time. And now he saw no joy in Christmas at all. Jessie's mom said, "Would you like to see the baby?" And John said, "Yes, I would like that very much. In fact, I'll go up and I'll take the baby, for I wouldn't want Jessie to wake up and see it." And so John went upstairs, and he looked at his wife sleeping there in bed, and he reached down and he kissed her forehead. And he picked up that dead child, and he carried it downstairs. And the stranger looked at the child, and he said, "May I hold the child?" John said, "Sure." And he handed the child to the stranger. And the stranger began rocking back and forth, holding the child. And he reached down and he kissed it on its forehead. And Jessie's mother said, "Why did you do that? The child is dead." And the stranger said, "The child is not dead. It has just never lived yet. But the child is dead." And John stood there watching as the baby opened its eyes, and it began to cry. And Jessie's mother took the child and took it back up to Jessie. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. You must stay and celebrate Christmas with us. No, I must be going along. But you can't. Look at all this food. You've got to stay. I can't. I'm needed elsewhere. But it's a bitter cold night. You can't go anyplace else tonight. Stay. Have Christmas with us. But the stranger insisted and went over and put on his hat and his coat. And John watched as he walked out into that snow-covered night. And as John pulled the door shut, he looked, and there were no footprints in the snow. The Christmas gift. There was a rabbit who had hopped underneath a hazelnut bush. He was panting very hard. His lungs, he thought they would explode, for he had been chased by a fox all night long. And he knew he couldn't stand underneath that hazelnut bush very long, for the fox would soon see his tracks and find him. And so the rabbit once again began to hop, and it hopped all the way up to a large bluff that overlooked a river not very far from where we're sitting tonight. The French that lived in the area called it the Pecatineur, River of the Big Canoe, for the Native Americans who would cut down the cottonwood trees and hollow them out. It had many other names. The Muddy Mo, the Big Muddy, would become known as the Missouri River. As that rabbit hopped up on that bluff, he looked, and to the east, he saw a very bright star. It was so bright, and the whole sky was lit with this one star. And it was very peaceful to just sit and look at it. And so he sat down there to watch that very bright star. The fox, it wasn't long until he too had tracked the rabbit up to the bluff. And as he came over the bluff and he saw that star, he went over and sat down beside the rabbit. It was so peaceful and calm. The star was so bright that night, all of the birds that had roosted in the trees were awakened, and they too watched that bright star, so peaceful. And there were some beaver and otters and muskrats swimming along the river that night. And when they saw that star, they too made their way to the bluff. And they sat there with the other animals and birds, watching that peaceful star. It wasn't long before a grizzly bear and a wolf and an elk and a doe with her twin fawns also made their way to the bluff. And when they saw that star, they took their place in the circle with the other animals, watching that star. Animals that normally would have been enemies with one another, watching that peaceful star. There were 3 old geese that had been awakened, and they were swimming on the river. When they saw that star, they began to circle, and those 3 old geese began flying towards that star, because everyone knows the geese are the wisest of the birds. Animal after animal of the forest came that night, made their way to that bluff. Finally, an old buffalo had been grazing, taking his nose and blowing away the fresh snow and eating the tender buffalo grass underneath. When he too made his way to that bluff, and he too saw that star. A hunter had been tracking that buffalo for many days, and he thought to himself, I am so close now. I will have food in my lodge tomorrow. And he followed those buffalo tracks until he came to the crest of that bluff. And he saw the buffalo, and he reached into his quiver, and he knocked an arrow to the bow, and he pulled back on that bowstring. And just as he was ready to release that bowstring, he too saw that bright star. And he went over and stood beside the buffalo. All night long, the animals and the birds watched that bright star, so peaceful, so calm. The next morning, one by one, the animals left and went down into the valley below. And that day, they say there was peace in that valley. The first Christmas in Missouri. Thank you.